Alrighty. Good afternoon, y'all. Both new and familiar faces. Welcome to another episode of Destructuring Tech, the podcast where we focus on unpacking the complexities of tech and software to simpler topics. A couple of weeks ago, we had Erin Williams with us to talk about her experience in transitioning her career and why tech could be the right place for you. We also talked about her experience of working tech adjacent and what other tech companies can do to improve their culture. If you missed that, no worries. You can always catch us on YouTube for the stream or listen to our podcast on Anchor, Spotify, and even Google Podcast. But just as a reminder, if you do catch us live, you can be a part of the conversations in the chat and even ask the guest questions. So make sure to follow us on YouTube if you haven't already to know when we're live. I want to appreciate everyone that is watching, be it live or catching us at a later time. The support is truly appreciated. I know time is precious, and we truly appreciate you spending some of that time with us. This is your host, Travis Rollins. I'm one of the instructors at the Turing School of Software and Design. And this has been something new for me, but I found it to be super rewarding thanks to the guests that join and listeners following along. I'm super excited for today's show because we don't have one, but rather two special guests with us today. Our first guest is Scott Ertmer, one of the front-end instructors at Turing, who I just love working with. I think, what was it? It might have been a couple years ago. I actually worked with you as an instructor. So super excited to have you on the show. And then we've also got Will Mitchell, the front-end director at Turing. Thanks so much, y'all, for being here today. How are y'all doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks. Thanks, Travis.
Awesome. Right on. Yeah. Appreciate it. I know we just came off from an intermission, which for those unfamiliar, we kind of just took a week off in between innings at the school. And did y'all do anything fun or just kind of catch up on some rest this last week?
It's definitely a healthy mix of like getting away from the computer and then also reacquainting myself with my couch. So I did some camping specifically to go see some of the meteor shower, the Perseids meteor shower. So I went down south for that. It was beautiful. Saw about 40, 50 shooting stars that night. And then I pretty much just had a long date with my couch after that.
That sounds perfect. That sounds like the dream right
awesome.
There, Scott. I love that.
Does sound good. Yeah, I fell into a rabbit hole reading about game theory, and that led me to spend large portions of the week playing online poker. So that was mostly what I did for a week.
That's amazing.
It was the book, huh? Not your gambling addiction, I take it, huh?
Correct. I don't have a gambling addiction.
I love that. So is that I feel like there's been like multiple phases with like online gambling. Can you actually use, because I know it's like been shut down in the past and then come back up. Can you actually use real money with this now?
Yeah. So it depends on where you are and also where the site is. So if it's a US based site, there's only 3 states, I think, right now where you can play poker online, although there's a lot of like online gambling via FanDuel and DraftKings that like sports betting that's already been legalized in a lot of different states. But then if you're playing like poker or other casino games on a site elsewhere, like, you know, you're logging into a site that's based in Europe, the rules are a little bit squishier. I'm sure there's actual rules. I just don't know them.
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome. Taking on some new things, making sure to relax a little bit. I'm loving. We've already got some people in the chat. Lita, Cass are watching. Lita's asking, and you don't have to answer this, Will, but Lita's like, "How rich are you now already?" So have you been making some winnings?
I'm roughly $180 less rich than I was at the beginning of last week. So that's where
I like to hear.
Putting the money towards having some fun, right? So
it's an experience. Yeah, exactly.
There you go. I love it. Awesome. Well, cool. Yeah, let's go. Let's do some more formal like introductions. I'll start with you, Scott. I'm excited to have you here. I'm sure most of the Turing community is familiar with what you do, but for those listening in who are not, do you mind telling us just a little bit about like your background and what you're like currently doing now?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I come from a family of educators. But literally everyone in my family has been a teacher at some point or another. And so that kind of just was always in my mind, always rattling around the back of my head. So I actually taught my where I came from professionally would be public education. I taught high school and middle school visual arts for, I think I made it to about 7 years before I finally got a little burnt out. And don't get me wrong, there were a couple pauses in between there as I tried to find a way to like engage with education. I love it so much, but it wasn't very sustainable in the public sector. And so then about 2 years ago, I kind of pulled the trigger, left public education, went to school at Turing, chose the front end program, graduated basically right in March of 2020. I think I was the last group of students to graduate in person. So very quickly was on the remote job search, had a few things lined up, but ultimately I got an offer from Turing to come work with them. And based on my experience with a student, getting to see just how much energy goes into like giving the whole student a really positive experience, I knew it was like really well aligned with my personal mission. So now I'm teaching the front end program. Right now, currently working in what we call Mod 3, a section of curriculum that dives deep into frameworks, even some backend stuff. Mostly working with React, Router, Express, and some Cypress in there as well.
Sweet, awesome, that's great. I think I'm curious, since you have that background in teaching for the last 7 years, went through Turing and then like got right back into teaching again. Like, what's been that experience? Has it? Do you feel like you're getting back into that like burnout, or has something like changed in that time?
It's a great question. You know, I definitely did not expect to find myself leading classrooms again. That was kind of like why I left teaching high school art. But ultimately, it's been like, I hesitate to say dream job because I don't really dream of jobs ever. But that said, I really feel like education is where I can give back the best, where I shine the best. And so to have an environment like Turing where I do feel supported, I do feel recognized for my efforts. I feel like I can be my whole self and not just, you know, a workhorse to put some grades in the books. Really helped me see that it wasn't like teaching I ever had an issue with, but rather the structure that I was a part of.
Awesome. Well, that's I'm super excited to hear that. Yeah, I feel like you absolutely provide so much value, both among the staff as well as like I know the students really appreciate the amount of work you put into every day. So yeah, excited to have you here, Scott. Well, we'll go with you next. Again, like I mentioned, it's an honor to have you here today as well. I'm sure a little introduction is needed, both with your experience as a programmer as well as being the front end director at Turing. But you know, catch us up a little bit with like some of your accomplishments and kind of like how you've made a mark in the industry and what your kind of role is nowadays.
Yeah, I'm not so sure my name precedes me that much. I might be like Turing famous, but my fame dwindles pretty quickly when you get like a few steps away from the virtual Turing office. Yeah, I got into programming as a second career. I When I went to college, I went for economics and then got into real estate after that, and that's just like the family business. So it was an easy entry point. Didn't really find that to be very fulfilling. And picked up software as a hobby actually, and just started making like websites for friends, and found that it was just much more fulfilling than what I was currently doing. And so I thought, you know, I didn't do this when I was growing up, but maybe there's some way that I can like make a career out of this. And went back to school, tried computer science for a little while, and ultimately found G School back when Jeff, our principal at Turing, was teaching G School. went through that program, which is very similar to what our current backend program is like, and then worked for, after getting out of that program, found a job doing Ruby on Rails development, and hopped around to a few different startups, and ultimately made my way back to Turing as an instructor. So yeah, that's kind of the journey. I forget what the second part of your question was, Travis.
Oh no, that's great. It just kind of like, what's your role nowadays? Being the front end director,
Right.
For some, they may not know exactly what that looks like. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So, I think, when I try to explain it to, it used to be really easy. My job at Turing, when I was explaining to people, what do? I teach students. Now it's really like much more, I spend very little time with the students and a lot of time with the instructors. So, most of my time is spent coaching the team and helping all the instructors on the front end team really get the most out of their own experience as an instructor and be the best version of themselves, and maybe, hopefully, if I'm doing my job right, help them all to be even a little bit better than they even think they can be.
Oh, yeah. That does not sound like an easy task, Will. But I'll say this. I feel like just being one of those instructors, one of those people you've been guiding, I appreciate all the work that you put into it. It definitely does not go unnoticed. So appreciate you. I have to ask one more question before we kind of get into some of our topics. Well, I think it's interesting. Like you were working out in the field for quite a few years, if I remember correctly. Like you started, what was it? You mentioned you joined,
I guess about
G School
5 years.
2014. 5 years.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
What kind of like brought you back? Like you were living the dream, right? As being a software developer. What brought you back to being working at Turing?
The dream. So it's a funny thing because we work so hard at Turing to help people really change their lives, right? And change their career trajectory and find the work that they really find deeply fulfilling. That being said, not every tech job out there is going to meet that bar. They're not all fulfilling. And some of them can be downright soul crushing. And no matter how much you love programming, if somebody makes you do something that you don't believe in day after day and use that hard won skill to do something that you find, at best morally ambiguous, you're not going to come home at the end of the day with your cup full. So I wanted to find something that would like fill me up and make me feel like the work that I did had a real impact. And when I came to Turing, I thought it might be transitory. I didn't know if this was going to be a long-term spot for me, but I think the work we do is so important that I'm able to go home every day. Well, I'm able to stay at home every day and feel at the end of the day that I am actually making a difference.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. Super wise words. As Lita mentioned in the chat, like always wanting to listen to Will's wisdom like all the time. So yeah, I think that's such an important piece. Like, is it line up with the mission? Is it line up with do you feel like you're making an impact? So 100%. Awesome. Well, cool. I know again we got quite a few topics to kind of get into, so we'll get started right away with that. Scott, you mentioned you had this kind of career transition, right, from kind of being a teacher to coming into Turing to get into software and coding and all those kinds of things. And has since then been kind of an instructor, kind of paving the way for other front end developers. So I'm curious, like, if you wouldn't mind, like, expanding a little bit more on like what initially got you into programming and why did you choose front end over back end? I feel like that's such a tricky decision there.
Sure. Initially, like the very seed of changing careers was like what I'm doing now is unsustainable. So I just started looking for like who's got a high quality of life, a good work-life balance. And I looked at a few things, right? At one point, I even considered like going back to school to be, I'll never remember the name of it now, but essentially a person who illustrates skeletons for injury reports for lawyers. Like I was looking all over
Oh,
the place, right?
cool.
Like
Yeah.
anatomical illustration, essentially. So I looked at a lot of things, but ultimately what drew me to programming, well, I knew somebody in the program, so I got to see the literal blood, sweat, and tears they were putting into it. So I knew it was going to be difficult, but hearing about the outcomes, what you got after you put in all this time into Turing or learning this skill, really kind of checked all those boxes for me. Not only was it a good work-life balance and a high quality of life, but another piece that was really important to me was to feel like I never had to stop learning. I, was after 7 years, I was pretty polished when it comes to teaching art. But a lot of the time I was teaching curriculum that was given to me and I kind of had to check boxes and I didn't feel a lot of personal growth myself. And so when I saw programming and I had the ear of someone who was in it currently, I was like, so you're done learning after you go through this program? And he just laughed in my face, right? Like you'll never be done. And that to me was actually a really big attraction because it meant that there was always going to be a new knot to untie or a problem to solve. And that to me is like continued growth, right? And that's kind of what I think makes a really high sustaining or well-sustaining life. But when it came to like front end versus back end, I honestly didn't think about it a whole lot, right? I was like, okay, front end, visual, I'm an artist, great, check. And I think I briefly looked at back end too, but once I realized that like the jobs you're applying for will pay you about the same, you'll get the same amount of time off, et cetera. I was like, well, then if the outcome is the same, aside from the fact that one seems more visual than the other, well, then I'll go with the visual because that's where my strengths lie. It turns out that that's not quite the case, right? Like front end developers are definitely not designers, but I wouldn't say that it hurts to have that visual eye. And so for that reason, I definitely am still happy to be on the front end team.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. I'm curious because you mentioned something about like you stated like this idea of like growth, right? There's just this continuous idea of growth as being getting into software development. I'm curious, like this is something I struggle with personally myself. Is like how do you measure that growth? Like how do you see that? And Will, feel free to jump in on this as well. But just curious, like how do you kind of approach that, Scott?
Sure. I first have to acknowledge that the person I knew who was in the program showing me the blood, sweat, and tears is now in the chat right now. So Matt Wren, thank you for your inspiration. I was like half hoping you wouldn't show up, but I'm happy to see your name here, man. So when it comes to growth, like how do I measure my growth personally? Is that what you're asking there, Travis?
Yeah.
That's tough. That's really tough. I think, and I'm guessing I'm not alone in this, but I have a pretty loud critical voice inside my head, right? And so it's very easy for me to make progress, but then diminish it to myself, like to say, oh, but I could have gotten further, or it could have been better. And so that's a really big challenge, right? Like if you are constantly down talking your progress and your growth, you're probably going to stop making it. And so I think for me, I've changed kind of my approach on like, am I growing or not? Less so much or less on the outcome of this particular challenge I'm taking on and more about the process. So is my process better sustained? When I hit a road bump, do I know how to work my way through it or around it? That to me is real growth, but not necessarily always just like, oh, cool, I did the thing, I didn't do that before. That's growth to me. To me, it's much more process over product, if you will.
I like that a lot, Scott. Like I very much empathize with the like worry more about the process. The product will take care of itself. I think it's funny, like the things that over the years I've told students to do that I then like need to remind myself to do, which I do to like a greater or lesser extent, depending on the thing. But I remember teaching Mod 1 and always telling students who were struggling, like, just look back 3 weeks from now. Like, what can you do today that you couldn't do 3 weeks ago? And as you go through the program, to keep doing that, and like, what can you do today that you couldn't do 3 months ago? And I think reflection is just so key when it comes to like measuring growth, as it were. You like, what am I doing now in my career that I wasn't able to do a year ago or 2 years ago? As long as I see a delta that I'm doing things that I didn't think I could do before, I'm growing, and that's good.
Man, I really appreciate you hearing you say that, Will. It's something I definitely do and didn't think to bring up, but like even just like if you have a good reflection process, whether that's once a week you sit down and think about your week or each day, like you said, if you have some sort of record of where you were before and you can easily compare that to now, you won't be able to deny your growth the way you might otherwise be able to.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Such key pieces there, I think. Like both this idea of like the process being more important than the product in many ways, right? And I feel like that's something I often tell students as well. But that's such a key piece. And then this idea of like reflection. If you don't ever have like anywhere to like measure yourself to, how do you ever see that growth, right? So I think that's all great points. So well, awesome. I appreciate y'all sharing on that. I know that was kind of like a random question kind of throwing in there, but I think it's a really cool point. Scott, I want to kind of like highlight one more thing that you mentioned in one of your previous statements about when you were first getting into front end and you were like, hey, this kind of like lines up with what I was thinking, like kind of design, like kind of very visual was kind of your first impression when getting into front end, and you realize like as you went through it, it kind of changed a little bit, right? Do you mind kind of going over a little or expanding a little bit more on like what kind of changed about there? You said that front end isn't so much design heavy. So what does front end exactly do?
Yeah. I guess I came in thinking that I'd be doing what I did back in middle school and like building my MySpace website, right? Like working with like HTML, CSS, and like literally designing how it would look. But very quickly it became apparent that that's not really the job of a front end developer. That's the job of a designer, right? And a developer is going to be the person who takes that design and can build it. That doesn't mean that like my strengths in the visual arena aren't useful here at all. It definitely still helps to have like a keen visual eye to be able to tell the difference in the slight border radius on that button compared to the next one, or that shade of blue versus this one. But ultimately, your job is not to design. Your job is to create the structure that allows that design to work, and then to attach all the behaviors or the logic to those various pieces of design. So when you click the button, it really does the thing, not just sit there and look pretty.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, I love that. Just quick shout out looking at the chat. Like, first of all, I have to appreciate everyone watching. And I think this is the first time we've actually got like a live chat, which is amazing as well. So cheers to, everyone that's here. Cass, Neek, Lita, just so many great people. Matt. I have to laugh. Lita was kind of agreeing with you on this, kind of getting that first taste of like HTML and CSS. She mentioned, that was kind of her first exposure as well, was during that same era, kind of working on like personalizing her own kind of, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, Xanga? I don't know. It's Xanga journal, kind of similar idea to kind of like MySpace and things like that as well. So very, very cool. But well, awesome. One more question, Scott, and then we're going to turn it right back to Will over here. But you mentioned you've dabbled, like right now you're in Mod 3, you said you're teaching kind of some front-end frameworks and things, but you're also teaching some back-end stuff like Express and things relating to that, right? So you've been kind of dabbling on with some like back-end experience as well. Did you find that difficult having started with front-end? And if you could go back, would you change your decision?
I definitely wouldn't change my decision, Drew. But I think that is probably more about the community that I connected with as I was in the program than it is about the content I was learning. Because now, digging into some of that backend stuff with Express or PostgreSQL, it's really apparent to me that like, oh, I like this. In some ways, I like it more because part of the challenge of the front end is like just working through all these different environments, like various different browsers or the terminal, where depending on where your code is running. But with the back end, it just felt, at least in the small taste that I had, felt a little more streamlined. A lot of the languages I was working with are newer, cleaner, easier to write. And so in a lot of ways, going through the front end program actually helped me to see, oh, I've done the hard part. And now I can teach myself this other stuff a little more easily because it seems to have some of the more modern conveniences compared to JavaScript, if you will.
Awesome. Cool. So interesting. Front end was the more challenging piece. Getting into back end was a little bit more streamlined at that point. Will, I'll pose the same question to you because you mentioned you started back end with Turing. I think at that time there was only a back end program. So, but have since then over your career kind of shifted a bit and are now the director in front end. Curious, like why the shift? What kind of excited you about front end development?
Yeah, I think to some extent it's a personality tick. I am the kind of person who just wants to keep like, well, what's over here? And like the grass is always greener somewhere else. And so just
Sure.
like keep trying to learn like what I don't know. And like I probably am just by nature a little bit more of a shallow learner than like somebody who wants to dive really, really deep on something, sometimes to my detriment. But yeah, that's kind of how the journey happened. I think it's also worth noting when I got started, the idea of a boot camp was still pretty new. And nobody had really even considered like, should we have a front end boot camp? It was just like, we have a boot camp for code. We're going to teach you how to code just broadly. And to some extent, the idea of building front end applications was still kind of new as well. It's, the last 5 years, 10 years has been just an explosion in terms of what you can do with a front end application. So you go to where the trends are a little bit.
Totally. Yeah, that's awesome. That definitely makes sense. And I think there's something to be said about like experimenting with different things and kind of seeing like what, to both of y'all's points, like tech is constantly changing, right? And so like it's nice to be kind of like on top of it. You don't have to like dive super deep into every single thing, but kind of seeing what the latest trends are and kind of like where things are going, I think is a key piece for sure. So I'm curious, in your experience with kind of working with both, do you find one more fulfilling than the other? Like if you had to pick one, would you do back end or front end?
No, actually, I don't think I find one more fulfilling than the other. It's, I think it's so much more like, it has so much more to do with who you're working with. Like the tools are kind of irrelevant. Like a front end application is not so different than a back end application. The interface is visual on a front end application, whereas the interface on a back end application is essentially just data, a stream of data. But the logic that goes into crafting an excellent application is very similar on the back end or the front end. But if you hate your coworkers, you're going to hate your coworkers on the back end as well as the front end. So it doesn't actually matter that much. I think what often gets lost is that programming is like a human endeavor. Code is just a tool that we use to work together to build technical solutions to problems. And so if you're working with great people, I mean, I'd use the jankiest programming language in the world. Like send me out there with like Fortran and like the punch cards. And as long as I'm working with great people, like I'll be happy.
Love that. Yeah. Environment, I feel like plays such a huge piece into anything that we do, right? Scott, to your point with like the teaching environment prior, right? Like it makes a massive impact on that. I'm curious, Will, just expanding on that even more, like having worked with multiple teams, some better than others, like what have you found? I don't think intentionally people are trying to be
Sure.
shitty people, right? But what has kind of like made those teams like been more successful and like created
Yeah.
that more positive environment?
Yeah. I think one of the things, and we've talked a little bit about this already, that makes programming unique is the constant learning that goes on. And Scott, how one of your, or I guess it was Matt, who just laughed and was like, no, the learning never stops. And so as long as you're working with people who like embody that belief, it's probably going to be pretty fun because you're working and learning together. You're tackling challenges with an eye towards, I don't know what the best solution is, but let's talk about it and let's collaborate and learn together. I think that's what makes it really fun. When you start to encounter rigidity, that can be less fun.
Yeah, for sure. I imagine like the more, well, and I think it's almost human nature. Like the longer you've been kind of stuck or doing the same thing, you kind of like, this is what has worked for me in the past. And it's very easy to get kind of stuck in those same ways. But I think to your point, right? Like it doesn't create freedom for discussion and willingness to try new things. So
yeah. And it's not to say like don't respect expertise.
Sure.
But I think the most senior engineer has something to learn from the most junior engineer. And as long as it's always a two-way street at times, it's going to be good.
Yeah. I love that. I want to shout out that one note, like to all of our Turing graduates or Turing people who are kind of like finishing up the program. Like you do have value that you can bring to even senior
100%.
engineers as well. So awesome. Well, shifting the conversation just a little bit, I think we get a lot of applicants at Turing, and like to your points, Scott, like people are looking for kind of that career change, which is both scary and exciting. And when they are looking for that, they're looking for something exciting, challenging, engaging, with the hopes for growth, both mentally and financially in many cases. That being said, I think there's some common themes that we often hear, and one specific example is there's this idea of I thrive in a challenging environment, so the front end is not quite the right place for me. Will, I remember you kind of bringing this up to us maybe a month or two ago, and so I'm curious, who would you say is saying this, and what kind of assumptions might they be making to think that front end is not a challenging environment?
Yeah. I don't know who is saying it, to be like, I think it's probably pretty diverse in terms of the group. I can make some guesses about why they might be saying it though.
Sure.
I think one of the big reasons people come is they want to make more money, right? And the natural inclination when you're going to plunk down $20,000 to try and learn a new skill is, I want to get the best value for my money. I want to get the most bang for my buck. I want the best chance of making the most that I can in this new career. So I need to do the thing that's the hardest, because generally I think this is true. There is a correlation between how difficult something is and how much you're compensated for it. Now, it's not always true. Like teachers out there, your job is incredibly difficult and you don't get compensated in commensurate form. But in programming, it's generally true. And so there's that piece of it. I think there's also a historical context where like front end, like I said before, is sort of a newer discipline in engineering, because like the browser didn't used to be powerful enough to like handle all of this like JavaScript being thrown onto a user's computer all at once. And so most of the like the computational complexity had to happen on the back end, and the front end was just like HTML, CSS, and just a little bit of JavaScript here or there to like pin it all together. And so if you're still like believing that that historical context is accurate, like thinking of some of the like the comments in the chat about MySpace, like if that's what you think front end is, it's not unreasonable to think like, well, that's not hard enough. Like I'm not going to be able to make enough money for this. I should do the thing that's more challenging. And what that misses is the fact that like the front end has evolved so much over the last decade that whatever application you're hoping to build, there's a good chance you can build it entirely on the front end. And like, it's not to say that that back-end engineering isn't also very valuable and doesn't serve a place. It absolutely does. It's still very integral to everything we do. But there are whole careers to be had on the front end that pay just as well as back-end development careers. And so, yeah, I think that's probably the why.
Yeah. Yeah. I love
one
that.
thing that came to mind when you said that, Will, yeah, we've got the people who like think web development hasn't changed in 20 years or whatever.
Right.
But I also think there's maybe a misunderstanding that, kind of going back to what I said earlier, that the challenge stops when you like graduate. Like I thrive in a challenging environment, so let me choose the hard thing now so I can maybe coast a little bit later. But it doesn't really add up, right? Like it's going to continue to be hard. You're going to continue to have challenges 5-10 years down the line. And so it doesn't make sense to think that like choosing this path or this path will be any less challenging unless you're thinking, well, it's only for these 7 months anyway, and then I know everything.
Yeah. I think it's also worth mentioning that like, if you don't have any context of programming languages, like you might think like this programming language, does it really matter which one I learn first? They're both probably about the same level of difficulty. But JavaScript is like a Frankenstein's monster of a programming language. And it is extremely powerful, but it has a lot of idiosyncrasies that are not true with other programming languages. As I was doing a little bit of prep for today, I was like wondering to myself, like how much of JavaScript's of the JavaScript language over the years has actually been deprecated. Because many programming languages, as they evolve into new versions, they get rid of stuff. Like they get rid of large portions of their code, and like backend applications, like Java applications, for example, they run on a specific version of that code. But on the web, like your JavaScript needs to work like forwards and backwards for like decades of time. And so just go do a Google search for like deprecated JavaScript. The MDN page you'll find will take you about 20 seconds to read. Like there are some things that have been deprecated over the years, but it's a one pager. It's super short. And that means all the rest of the stuff that has been added on over the years is still there and is still valid. So it can be really challenging as a new person to know like what is the right JavaScript to use in this scenario. So if you're looking for a challenge, there's a sturdy one to be had in learning everything you can about JavaScript.
I love it. Yeah, that's so interesting. Like to think of that, like how things really haven't like deprecated at that point compared to like these other languages where just version upon version upon version. So yeah, that's interesting. I'm gonna have to look that up after this. Kind of Google the MDN version of what has actually deprecated. So, y'all both mentioned like how challenging front end is, and I think for some who have actually had exposure to it like that, yeah, they have that kind of clear vision of it. But for those who might be kind of new, who are still kind of trying to grasp what is challenging about that, I'm curious, like, what is, if y'all could like expand a little bit more, like what is some like specific things that are challenging, and if there's anything, you both have like years of experience at this point, what is something that you continue to find challenging with front end development?
Have you ever tried to center a div? It's tough. It's really tough, especially if you're not using Flexbox or something.
Yeah.
Jokes aside, that definitely is a part of it. I mean, you're working with, and this is true, I think, of all programming, not necessarily just front end, but if you're new to this world and you're trying to decide front end and back end, this is going to be a challenge regardless of which way you go. But I think there's just so many levels of abstraction, and you have to just eventually get to a point where you're like, okay, that's happening under the hood. I don't necessarily need to know exactly how that works if I have a general idea. But as someone who does like the rabbit holes, that is kind of difficult for me. Like I could find myself diving down those holes instead of keeping my focus on the feature I need to add next or whatever it might be. But like, just kind of like to illustrate some of that abstraction, like if I want to put a square box on the page, I can't just like draw a square, right? I have to define an element. I have to like, decide how it's going to interact with the other elements on the page. Does it have any interactions or behaviors? Then I have to define those too. And all of those are not just like typing in English, right? Or whatever language is your first language, but it's like working with established sets of tools that have been broken apart into all these discrete chunks, ostensibly to make it easier for you. But at the same time, those levels of abstraction can seem really intimidating and easy to get lost in if you're unfamiliar or just new to the programming world.
Yeah, I would totally agree, Scott. It's funny that you brought up centering a div, because it, on one hand, it's like tongue in cheek, but it brings up this really interesting point about front end development, in that there's just like this ocean of edge cases you have to deal with everything that you try to do. Like you're putting that div is going to live in a browser, in somebody's browser, on somebody's computer. But like, even the people watching this today, you're probably not using the same version of the same browser, even if you are using the same browser. And so like, if I'm using, Microsoft's Edge, and somebody else is using Firefox and somebody else is using Chrome, like they all have like a lot of things that they share in terms of how they display things. But they have a lot of differences too. To build something crappy is not difficult. To build something really professional grade on the front end is really, really challenging, because like you have to take into account all of these little idiosyncrasies across all the various tools where your thing is going to be seen. And I didn't even talk about like the mobile browsers that have their own various like idiosyncrasies. And that is also true of the JavaScript that's going to run in those browsers. Like different browsers have different support for different pieces of JavaScript. So it's like, I think the real challenge of it is, and maybe always will continue to be, trying to do something really well in a ever-changing environment with lots of different rules.
Yeah,
100%.
absolutely.
I think I also want to shout out what Lita said in the chat about the front end having to deal with users. They are always going to do the thing you don't expect them to do, and that alone adds to that ocean of edge cases, as you so perfectly put it, Will.
100%. Yeah. I think about like all the times like I have to fill out like different forms, and whether it's adding my credit card information or it's adding my address to something like that. I don't know about y'all, but I like fuck that up like at least a couple of times like every week, right? So and if I was just sending in like incorrect information, let's say like I messed up my credit card number, or I messed up my address a little bit, like if there's no kind of like checks for that, as like users like maybe misinterpreted something or mistyped something or whatever it might be, if there's no checks for that, like, well, there's, you could be sending anything across the web, right? So having some control or some like checks, I would say, for like, is the data formatted the way I expect it to be worked with, right? So there's so many different pieces, whether it's user interaction or the browser, the version of it. It's a layers upon layers upon layers for sure. So, but cool, yeah, awesome. I think I want to end maybe more on like a more spicier question before we start to wrap some things up. You know, both of y'all have mentioned like things are constantly changing, right? Whether it's front end or back end, the frameworks. We didn't even get into testing and how that happens, but to your point, what you stated, Will, like especially with front end, it's very young. It's grown a lot in the last decade, but it's still very young and still changing a lot. So I'm curious, like, I've heard some developers tell me that at some point we're going to get rid of frameworks. We're going to go back to vanilla JS because that's better. That's the faster way, which, if I told that to my students, I think they might cringe a little bit. But or there's others who are talking about, cloud programming stuff, with AWS and Kubernetes and things like that. So, always changing. But I'll start with you, Scott, with the spicy question. I always love to hear others' thoughts on this. What do you think the future holds for front-end developers? And, 5 to 10 years from now, what's going to be the same? What's going to be different? Are we going to be living back in vanilla JS land, or what do you think?
I'd hope not. I really hope not. I don't personally see them going anywhere anytime soon. The more I look at jobs postings or hear about the jobs my students are applying to, almost every one of them deals with some framework or another. So I don't particularly see that going away, at least not like immediately, even if it is faster to do things, vanilla JavaScript style. And maybe it's not the spiciest take, but I do think one change it's kind of already started. That's maybe what is like bringing this down to like a mild take here, is just moving away from like dedicated desktop apps to more things that run just in the browser itself. I can think of a recent example. I use a password manager, Dashlane, which like deprecated their desktop application, the one I was so used to using, and now it entirely runs just in the browser or maybe in an extension or something like that. So I think that's maybe something we'll see, just because people aren't necessarily wanting to download a whole application if they can access the same features on just by opening up a website. But I think that means that we'll start to see an increase, or already are seeing an increase in just the amount of what a user expects feature-wise or customizations that they can add to the applications. Like an easy one here is like light mode versus dark mode, right? Everyone's screaming on the internet about we all need dark mode. And I only imagine that just kind of extrapolating to be a much more customizable experience, not just in terms of the user interface, but maybe different features you add, or running chat right there in the browser window instead of just having to look for an email to contact someone. Like, expectations are just really high for what a front-end application should do. And I think that's only going to keep increasing, which of course means great things for my students coming out of the program.
Oh yeah. Awesome. I love that answer. Will, what do you think? Do you agree, disagree with any of those things?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know what the future's going to hold. If I did, I'd just go trade stocks all day long, and I'd retire
right,
happy. But like, the idea that frameworks are going to go away in favor of using vanilla JavaScript all the time is probably one of the dumbest notions I've heard lately. If you think about what a framework is, it's really just a series of decisions that have been made for you on how to do common tasks. So if you throw the framework aside, you have to come up with a way to do all those common tasks. So all you're going to do is build your own framework. And then when other people come onto your team, they're going to have to learn your completely bespoke framework, which happens, and it's a nightmare. So like, while there might be people out there who are like, we're just going to go back to building this like straight with JavaScript, or we're going to just use like Java for this backend application. I'm going to make my own Ruby framework. Like, the frameworks aren't going anywhere because people understand, like, if I need to build something quickly to solve a business challenge, there's no faster way of doing it and getting it stood up quickly than starting with a framework that has these decisions already made. So the frameworks are going to change, absolutely, as people like argue and debate over like what is the best way of solving these new challenges, or as the underlying hardware changes, how do we build the interfaces into our frameworks to make sure we can like take advantage of those things. But the frameworks aren't going away. So do I know for sure that we're going to be teaching React at Turing 5 years from now? I do not. Would I bet the farm that we're going to be teaching some kind of framework? Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. +1 to all of that. Yeah, I think about that. Even if you have a team that's working in vanilla JS and you decide like these are going to be the things that we're going to do and how we approach that, what do you do when you change out like people in your team as well, right? You know, if you have some kind of framework or something, at least they might be familiar with some of the standards and practices there. But if you completely take that away, that rule set away, like shit, you're gonna have to reteach someone every single time you hire a new person or whatever. So yeah, that's
like
I'm
the same reason like we're going to invent our own programming language to build our own application. Like, no, you're going to pick a language that's already there because it's way easier. So
exactly. Awesome. Well, you know, y'all, I really appreciate everything and all the wisdom that you both have been sharing. You know, I think reality is like, you know, tech is always changing, but there, as y'all stated, there are unique challenges, and there are they each have their own rewards, whether you choose front end or back end. And while I think it's difficult to decide which one you want to start with, to both of y'all's cases, like you're not bound to one either. So I'm curious, like any like final thoughts or words of advice to people who are still trying to make a decision right now.
You know, I guess I'd just say don't overthink it. If you're interested in the field because you know, like, there is that infinite learning we've been talking about, the challenging environment will be there either way, then do one of those, you know, short workshops where you get your hands on some code. You see if you even like this thing, right? And if you do, just, are you visual? Are you not? It doesn't matter too much. I'd say whatever's calling your name, just trust that and go with it, because as Will is an example of, you can always pivot. Learning one will enable you to learn the other. You're really just opening both doors, even if you only go through one of them at the same time.
Yeah, I could not agree more, Scott. I think the simple fact is you're ultimately going to want to learn both of them over the course of your career. And that often leads people to ask, well, which one is easier to pick up second? Neither. They are both like challenging to move into from the other. That's the wrong question. The way to think about it in my mind is, what is going to hold your interest for the 7 months that you are here? Because it is going to be extremely challenging regardless of where you go. One program is not easier than the other program. To a person, it might seem that way. But the simple fact is they're both extremely rigorous. It is no small thing to take somebody from I've never done this before to I get paid $80,000 a year to do this for a living. And that's the case in both the back end program and the front end program. So pick something that you think you're going to be able to stick with and like hold on to, because ultimately when you want to learn the back end after coming from the front end, you're going to be able to do that. Hopefully somebody will just be paying you at that point.
Yes, absolutely. Awesome. Yeah, I love it. Great words of advice, y'all. Well, I think, you know, speaking of this idea of like continuing to learn and you know, exploring new things, you know, well, we got a little bit of some things you're exploring with some of the gambling things, but just curious, like for you both, you know, what what are you either working on currently or towards like the future? What do you kind of have your sights on, either technically or professionally? What are some things that you're working or learning right now?
Sure, yeah, I can start. You know, I don't think my interest in the like visual realm of programming has gone anywhere. So things like processing or like programmatic animation are always super fascinating to me. Variable font technology, which is essentially just fonts that you can program to be responsive in each character themselves. But beyond that, I'm definitely interested in learning some more of the backend. Like I mentioned earlier, I found it to be a pretty warm welcome, at least initially. I'm sure those challenges will crop up along the way, but I wouldn't mind getting into some Ruby at some point.
Nice, awesome. How about you, Will?
Yeah, I think, you know, I've like transitioning into the director job, like chief among my roles is that of coach, for both of you, obviously, and the rest of the front end team. And so a lot of my professional development time lately has been spent, you know, trying to figure out what is it that I need to know about this world of coaching that I don't already. And so reading some new books, reading about people who've been very successful as coaches over the years. So yeah, that's what I've been spending quite a bit of time with.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, I appreciate y'all. You know, I guess to kind of wrap things up, like if our listeners have any kind of follow-up questions or they just want to learn more about you, how might they reach out to you if they have any follow-up questions? We'll start with Scott.
Oh, it's hard to find me on the internet these days. I guess you can find me on LinkedIn, begrudgingly.
Okay.
I do have one of those. It's just Ertmer, Sertmer. If you're interested in any of the art stuff that I've done in the past or anything like that, you can find me on Instagram at Dirty Erty. And beyond that, come to Turing. Just come in, you know, pay the tuition, and we'll hang out. It's easy, real easy.
Hell yeah.
I would agree. Coming to Turing is definitely the best way to get in contact with us. I also have a LinkedIn. I wouldn't say it's a great way to get in touch with me. You free to email me, will@turing.edu. And yeah, I check that on at least every other day. So I'll see it.
Awesome. Awesome.
I apologize.
Well,
my dogs are losing their mind. If you've heard a lot of barking in the background, somebody rang the doorbell, and that's the worst thing you could possibly do if you're a dog. So.
Hey, that's okay. No worries at all. Totally get it. But yeah, I can't tell y'all how much I appreciate both of you, Scott and Will, being here tonight and just giving up some of that time to be here on the show. So thank you so much. Thank you, the listeners, for tuning in, being a part of the chat, and be it live on YouTube or tuning in with us later on Anchor, Spotify, Google Podcast, which is always hosted shortly after the stream. So we've got some exciting guests actually coming up over the next couple of weeks as well, including Jeff Forsberg, who graduated from Turing a couple of years ago and is currently working at Turbine Labs. So make sure to tune in with us again next week on Monday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. Reminder, that is 3 p.m. Pacific Standard and 6 p.m. Eastern Time. But hey, thanks for listening in, y'all. Stay safe and well, and until next time. Ciao.
Thanks, Travis.
Thanks, Travis.